So I'm going to start again about my project. It's called Operation H.A.U.N.T, H-A.U.N.T, hosting operations for the urban need of transformation. It's basically, the goal is to virtually occupy abandoned buildings in Detroit by projecting images of people and environments of education and learning. And my constituency is allied media is about combining technology and online media with social justice movements. And so my goal here through this interview is to use what I learned from the public in Detroit to inform what gets projected onto these buildings, whether it actually be the interview or something else. So my first question is, what essential role or roles does a building play in public education? And by public education, I mean the public, not necessarily funded by the government.
Well, I definitely think the building is a kind of a cropping mechanism. The idea of learning in general is so vast and inexhaustible that the minute we get inside of a building and we're limited by not only the walls but what can be expressed within a controlled space, it makes lessons far more intentional. And therefore allows us to have some sort of consistency amongst everyone that's involved within space.
Yeah, I think to build on that, it provides a landing pad as well, a place to go, structure, teaches a regimen, routine, and building off of what you just said.
I think even on a more basic level than that, it's a backdrop to the education. It's not really active all the time in our minds. Whereas teaching might seem like an activity that happens within a space. The space itself has a direct influence on the nature of the activity. So a one-room schoolhouse has a very different type of education and feeling than, I don't know, an inner city high school with several hundred students in it.
And actually that brings up, you guys brought up a great point, is that the building itself can teach versus what's being taught within it, or the potential of what could be taught within it. And the idea that lessons can come from order. A lot of people today think that repetition is, it gets boring and we get distracted by all these new things. And really it's the repetition of multiplication when you're very young, of your alphabet. Those are your fundamental ideas that a lot of times the bubbles that we can move between say are not valuable.
Okay, so would you say that a vacant building can fulfill any of these roles, and how?
Well, I think in the context of your project, you have to define what vacant means. So if vacant is kind of void of, actual human occupation of the structure, then, education needs to happen between people. So if people aren't in the building participating in education, therefore the building is vacant, then it's not participating. But if you're using it in a more abstract way, like we brought up in the last question, as a backdrop, as a cropping mechanism, as a kind of stage for an interaction that maybe isn't people, that isn't occurring between people in the building, but it's occurring between the building as a surface with a projection and people passing by it, then it can definitely play a role in the kind of education dialogue.
Might also want to ask if a building can ever even be vacant, going back to what your definition of vacant is. Because as soon as the organized and the structured program moves out, there's going to be a new program that moves in. Maybe it's not as organized. Maybe with the example of some of the buildings in Detroit that are vacant, there are other types of people that move in and use it for different purposes.
And just because there's a vacancy, a lot of times a vacancy is highlighting. A lot of times I think a vacancy is empty. But as you brought up, it draws a whole bunch of attention to the vacancy, and that almost in counteraction highlights the fact that there was something there. It's kind of a presence of an absence, which can be really powerful. A quiet, hush person in the back room is the one that everybody wants to watch out for, who's going to do something wild, because their quiet is concerning. And it's that kind of, I think, mystique about Detroit that has drawn people in the way you say, to a negative fashion. I think it really highlights and draws your attention to what could be, and people are really empowered by potential.
You're familiar with Michigan Central Station?
Yes, I'm
So that building is, as it were, vacant, and look how much attention it gets.
Mm-hmm.
The ruin for it.
Right.
Yeah, I think in a literal sense, sure. Can a vacant building be a place for education? Absolutely. It's a blank canvas. So as you said before, it's broadening your spectrum of what you can do in that space. So in just more of a literal sense of an open, empty building that is kind of broken down and not much in it, sure, you can use that empty space as whatever you want. What can you teach there? Is more the question.
But also the history part of it too, kind of like blank canvas, that there was something going on there at one point, and at one point or another, I mean, there's still a history to it that I think that still is valid to study upon as education now.
Because technically every ruin throughout history, every archaeological site, all of those historical sites in Rome are technically vacant, but as objects they have so much information kind of built into them that people's interaction with them, it's still a transfer of knowledge and information and history that just happens with kind of an exterior relationship with that building.
That made me think of something attached to the idea of the Roman ruins and how often they used obelisks, which were stolen, imported from Egypt, from that part of the world, and that it's not just a single layer of history. There's depth to it. I've heard it called spolia, that sort of reusing of some of the culture's garbage.
Right.
It's like using the rubble of an old building to build a new one.
So there's something really almost instinctual. If you think of hermit crabs moving from one shell to the next, there's something kind of ingrained in animals and mammals and people that want to occupy space, and the opportunity, I think something very much in the human nature to want to learn, is probably the primary function that you can use in any space as an opportunity to grow what separates us from other living things, and going beyond that first layer. That's pretty out there.
I guess I would maybe throw a question back on you. If so, this term, this idea of vacancy, and a lot of the buildings around Detroit have vacated people almost as if they up and left one day and left everything there. There's pictures left on desks, and things have been messed around with people that have broken into these buildings, but it's just left as a disaster. And is that kind of stuff left in place? Does it become the historical teaching of the building? And like we were saying, everyone's left their mark there, and it's still very obvious, what was going on in these places. Dentist's office with the chairs that still exist. So I guess asking the question to you is, in your project, are you going to be projecting in spaces that are still have everything left in it, or are you going to modify the space, or what's going to happen?
Well, I haven't decided on locations yet. What I take from the interview, I guess, is going to inform the the selections I make and where I would see the most potential for learning, like a learning experience. Not necessarily to renovate the building as a school, but to use it as sort of either a gathering place or like just a marker, kind of an anchor for the school.
Yeah, kind of like a community gathering to draw people in.
So going back real quick, this idea of the hermit crab is really great because, and this idea in general of education, of, let's see, H can be hermit crab, trying to remember the name. This idea of occupation versus being so ingrained in the kind of architectural space of a school is great because fundamentally education happens, teaching happens as a passing of knowledge between people. And when we think of schools, they're so kind of hard and heavy, and there's so much of the educational process that's kind of baked into the kind of physicality of a classroom and of a school, the way the chairs are set up, the way the technology is integrated into the whiteboard, the way that connects to the students. It's all very kind of removed from the kind of human nature of it. But the idea of people occupying an abandoned building lends itself to kind of it being a shell that they're using, temporarily, or that shell could be anything. You could move from one to the other, and it kind of refocuses education on that passing of knowledge between people.
That's a very good point. All right, so let's
Next time.
yeah,
We'll
next.
have an appendix.
See if we
add extra
There'll be an
comments.
asterisk in the video somewhere.
All right, so focusing more on the kinds of buildings. So which do you think would be more helpful in educating Detroit's youth? A large building in a central location house many students and teachers with lots of resources, or smaller buildings, more smaller buildings, more spread out for local neighborhoods, but with not so much resources?
So there's some trends going on in elementary education right now that deal with kind of how young people kind of grow and how they see not only their environment but other people. So it's a big trend right now to have K through 8 schools instead of K through 5 and then a middle school and then a high school, to try to keep students together for longer periods so that when you're a kindergartner, you see the older students, you have role models, and then as you grow, you're kind of passing younger kids in the hall. You have to learn to be, kinder to them. You still see your first grade teacher when you're in 8th grade, so you're kind of, you still have, okay, Mrs. Jones, I'm still trying to be that good boy that you remember from first grade. So trying to kind of humanize kids as they grow up, so they're not just kind of segregated with their own age group, and then it becomes about like this kind of Spartan, like, oh, I have to be the coolest 8th grader. It's like, no, because you're also with your younger siblings and your friends' younger siblings and these teachers that you've known for a long time. So there is something to be said about having schools that are capable of keeping that number of students over that span of time.
Yeah, just not going ahead and leaving behind what you lived through.
Right.
Yeah. Growing up to understand that what you went through is there and you're still learning from it. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Go for it.
Found a way to say what I was going to say before. I think there's something maybe a little bit dangerous built into the question, because it's asking you to pick one or the other. And that's very similar to actually the way that public education within large inner cities works right now. That very highly structured, that this is right, this is wrong answer. There's one person in the front of the class who is the pronouncer of all knowledge and provides it unto their students. I think we've seen in many cases that that's not necessarily the most successful way to educate people. it's the most successful way to indoctrinate people, but maybe not educate people. So I would ask, does it have to be one system? Does it have to be one or the other? Can it be both? Can it be any? Can it be a layering of multiple types of systems?
Yeah, I think your solution is definitely gonna be the one to not only give A or B those options, but there's the lab school in DC, there is Montessori style Montessori, there are oodles out in Bloomfield Hills, I believe, they have the Roper School, whole different pedagogy to how that's structured. Yes, it's one school, but that I think is the answer to a lot of your architectural questions. It might be the interaction, half of it on digital. You didn't even give that as an option right now. They have the hybrid classes where sometimes you're in school. A lot of universities are doing that now, half online, half in class. And also there's kind of a trend, I know also you said to keep people together, but to fragment and trying to offer more electives and getting a broader knowledge base. And Morphosis did a project in California, intentionally about 20 years ago, took all the disciplines and in on one campus, broke them up more collegiately. So it had kind of a cohesive unity, but was still fragmented in between. And it felt like the one large encompassing place, while having small, more localized. So I think the solutions that you're going to propose are going to really answer that type of question. I think there's one that's better or worse.
Yeah, I think when you start talking about a dispersal of resources and how students then get assigned to those resources, it's a question of, do you break up the different parts and pieces? So do you look at it based on age and say, we're going to break up this age, we're going to break up that age? Or do you break up the resources and say, we're going to have a science school that the students go to every once in a while and a history school that they go to every once in a while? Or do you cut a section through all of the parts and pieces and say, here is this very relatively small community that has all of the aspects that we're talking about, and then over here in the next neighborhood you have another one where you're able to accomplish kind of having a little bit of everything and maybe a little bit of every age group.
Versus specializing more intensely.
Right, right. So that's another way to look at it.
But when I first saw that question, I thought about like Lawrence Tech, where it's a campus of school where people come to learn, but each building, kind of like what Josh and Brian was saying, that there's a architectural building, that's where you do your architectural work, science and tech and engineering, so it's kind of divided. So it's kind of get mixed up, like how you see that question. It's like, do you see it has like small individual pieces, or it has like a group of like a macro, micro kind of deal of how do you read that question? This kind of depends on how do you look at that campus.
It's also, there's a question about age and autonomy. So at what point in a child's development, are they able to feel comfortable as an individual versus they have to kind of see themselves as part of a family or a group? So, we're talking about public education in general, but the question might be kind of segmented for the age groups, and then there's a different answer as you move through.
I would also say too, specifically to your location or situation that you're focusing on, because your question kind of suggests a prototype without really paying attention to the context that it might be set in, and you're looking for more of, Detroit as knowing this context. You have issues of control and power of that you have to deal with in getting students to, or getting people to even migrate to this location or these locations, security and safety, which, the one, per se, a large centralized puts a lot of earnest on the people in transit versus taking something to them. And that's something a lot of times people, especially in struggling cities, can't do, is senior citizens, is make that mobility factor play in their favor.
So what roles can online media and modern technology play to fulfill the needs of public education? And when I say modern technology, I mean like in regards to online, digital, not necessarily like physical.
So one thing, and this is outside of the traditional educational conversation, like schools, but you know, the new media can kind of bring knowledge and bring education into kind of more aspects of someone's day. So if you look at the games that people play on their iPads, you know, there's some educational aspects being worked into those. So, you know, if you have a generation of kids that are growing up really familiar with the screen, you know, that's an opportunity to kind of get them in the classroom, you know, outside of the classroom. So it spreads it out during the day and into other aspects of play, et cetera.
Yeah, I think it plays the role of the previous question too. You know, how large or how many resources do you have? And then does that make a difference? So if technology gives you infinite resources of a certain type, it allows you to connect, again, almost infinitely with other people. Can it be the connection between all the smaller schools that are spread throughout? It plays, I think, just a big role in communication and how people can interact, like you said, when they're not actually at the location. Can they tap into these locations from home? So they're virtually there. And so this little node becomes actually quite large.
So like at CERN, I know it's kind of weird, but at CERN, when they're doing the science experiments, all this information that they have is stored on this one central location, but anywhere in the world you can tap into and look at all this stuff they're doing, so that like kind of what Matt was saying, that this one central location can be branched out to all this other location within a click of a button. So that's it.
I would think about it too in terms of the user or just people in general, because there's this theorist, and if the lineage of communication first was orality, then it went to literacy, people reading and writing, and now we're kind of in what he calls electracy, which is basically all three in digital media. So I would think about different generations and how they might experience that differently. Kids are used to having all this media and information at their fingertips, which we didn't really have that necessarily when we were really little. So that might impact how you think about program and the user.
That actually is a great point, because architecture in itself is one of probably the most initial technologies that was ever developed. So even in your attempt to kind of merge these two, you're merging a really long history of really something fundamental with people, is developing tools and solving problems. And buildings were one of those first sheltered issues. I had one caution with the very excitement about the digital fusion, and that's you can get so much information out, and perhaps in Detroit, where spreading of information is not something that is strong, but in societies where spreading of information is really intense and done well, I wonder if we're beginning to lose the ability to infer. I think webcam, as we've kind of, you see behind us, moved into that mode. I think that helps substantially. But I know for me, if I, for example, send a text message, it's about 6 more messages in order to get my explanation across of what I meant by that word. I do this with Laura all the time. She's like, I don't know what that means. And, for me, inference and tonal qualities and what is not actually explicitly instructed is a huge part of this. You said earlier, the passive side of education. And, you know, that's something that I don't know. You have to assess the constituents, but the ability to infer and to exchange information, I think are equally valuable.
To expand on that, maybe the digital media is a great way to transfer huge amounts of data and just basic unanalyzed information very quickly through text, through video, through speech, through all of that. But it carries much less emotional impact than oral communication, and it carries much less intentionality maybe than literary communication. So it would be worth looking at these different types of learning, what is beneficial about them, what is detrimental about them, and maybe how that lines up with how people learn, the different types of learning. People can be learn best through listening, people can learn best through reading. I'm sure people can learn best through going to find the information themselves on the internet versus having someone else give it to them.
Yeah, the technology you're talking about, I know we're on video and you're talking about projecting, but as he mentioned, if you could have just sounds, there's something really haunting about just sound, especially when you're the only one there and they say it's dark. That's really gets you to an emotional level and begins to teach you of an awareness that, you know, you might have scent of some sort, that, you know, you begin to program lessons that seem more unintentional, but are definitely trying to get across, per se, your story, which I don't think any of us, and I know you haven't quite got into it yet, but what the story is that you're trying to share, what you're trying to teach from your point of view, and that might be you mediating your constituents, what they need, or, you know, you bringing in ideas and talking with them and kind of being an intermediary, and then projecting that to people who haven't been in that conversation. I think your story is really important in answering the last two questions.
I think also when it comes down to it, there's multiple layers to what happens in education. One of them is the transferring of specific info from, you know, one person or a source to a student. But in terms of being in school, being in a classroom, there's also this kind of meta layer of just social interaction. So when you're in school, you're a student, you have a large peer group, you have another layer of people that are above you, and you're there every day and you learn how to navigate that. And by taking out the human interaction aspect of education, then that's a big part of social learning. You know, even if there wasn't a topic being discussed, there wasn't information being transferred, but just being in that situation where you have a lot of different people and kind of a hierarchy of people that you then have to figure out how you fit into that and how it affects you, how to use it, how to exist within it. If you start to lose that in place of technology, then you lose something else that's really important.
I'm a W, and everybody jokes about it, but I'm conditioned, and I feel really uncomfortable if I sit at the front of a room. I go immediately to the back corner, because for years and years I knew I was over there, just the seating chairs. I don't know, there's something really simple about it, but I feel comfortable in that kind of location, spatially. Not that that has anything to do with anything. I'm just
Conditioning has a lot to do with it.
Alright, so for the last question, can modern technology and online media be used in conjunction with an abandoned building to create a new space, real and or virtual, for educating the public? And how?
Absolutely, I think we've really run that one.
I think if we've done anything, we've said that, well, anything is possible with any type of education, really.
So I think that the trick with that is going to be, does the abandoned building just act as a canvas, or does the information being projected is the sum of the parts, or is the whole greater than I'm having a George W. moment here. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts, something like that. Yeah. Are you gonna? Is there a way that you can use what's being projected in conjunction with what is projected on to get more out of it versus just saying, here's an abandoned building that I'm highlighting by projecting something onto it? Because then you're falling into the trap that you are kind of critiquing from the beginning by just the ruin in and of itself as an object is, you know, something sexy to take pictures of. So unless you're able to make the abandoned building like an inherent part of what you're communicating, then you're falling into that trap.
I think what you've been talking about when you say social media is there, if you look at the successful sites, and when I say successful, I mean wildly successful, be it Facebook's, YouTube's, it is because there is content that I feel passionate about that's connected to me being shared in a way that I have crafted it to share. And I think if you do choose per se to use the building as canvas, perhaps there's an interaction with, hey, while I was off doing this, I learned this, and then instead of per se watching it on YouTube, it's instantly projected per se on this building. So then it becomes a collage of information that might be more pertinent to people in that exact neighborhood that you as the, I don't want to say outsider, but the one coming in and observing might not be as aware of because you haven't learned it yet and grown up in that particular situation. So having per se people within the situation in that local area equally as respectable in a sense of they know information that they're willing to share that's pertinent to that area is just as valuable not only to the meaningfulness of a education facility in a community, but to the people that are learning that information and then wanting to then share using that kind of centralized location. If that makes any sense.
Maybe to expand on it a little bit, you can, a lot of these questions have been sort of dichotomous. It's not really a very pretty word, but this option or the other in the way that they're set up. So if you approach the community with this vacant building and say, okay, we're going to do this, or if you just set out their options for them, I think it will be far less successful than if you can open it to the community so that they have control and ownership of it. Because us as architects have a very inbuilt urge to want to say this is this and it will only ever be this.
This
But,
is my idea,
yeah,
I did that, that's me.
I'm the creative one, I'm God floating above this architecture, making it, and it will be that way. When in reality, the users will use it however they want to, no matter what you think, no matter what you do. And it's the same way with this sort of how you can use the vacant buildings in these neighborhoods. Well, the community has to first take ownership of it, because otherwise they're just going to ignore it, really.
So I guess the key is what do you provide to them to make them take ownership? Because it's already there, I guess. So that's his point exactly with the project is I need to do something to bring attention to these buildings so people will take ownership of them. And you know, giving that instant gratification and feeling a part of something bigger by being allowed to interact with it is, I think, the key.
But the real danger there is you also don't want to assume that a neighborhood hasn't already taken ownership of a vacant building on their block because, you know, people are very aware of their surroundings. They're worried about their own safety, and if there's a vacant house on your block, you probably watch that house more than you watch your next door neighbor's house, and they're the ones who are going through and checking to see if it's boarded up, or you know, has somebody moved the board from the front door? Could there be somebody in it now? Is the grass being mowed? Are there, you know, do we notice that there's extra, you know, fast food trash around it? Maybe there's people hanging out in there, like, you know, to assume that it needs to be brought to their attention is potentially a fallacy. So the first step when selecting a site is maybe select a community and then find out what the relationship with a vacant building is, and then use that as the basis to develop the actual intervention that happens.
In a lot of K-12 schools here, people, before the 60s, a lot of that generation care about where they went to school. Oh, you know what, I graduated from Mumford. You know what, people care about that. And perhaps tapping into, as you said, that kind of, I don't want to say nostalgia, but an already pre-existing connection, and finding those specific people that are connectors and using them as your first phase to begin to build a school that a larger constituency can find meaning in, may also be an approach.
Because if a vacant building is in a neighborhood, you could probably ask anybody on the block and they know who the owner is, if there is one. They know if that owner is up on their taxes. They've written letters to the city saying, hey, you need to give this person a ticket. They're intimately connected to that building and trying to make something happen with it.
I mean, like the prime example for that is a train station that's brought up. I mean, it's gated that you can't get into it, but like, okay, well, yeah,
Unless you
exactly.
really want to.
Exactly. But I think that's
Get over
exactly
the
the
razor.
point. But that they're like, hey, keep away. But like Matt's like, I've been there, you know.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like, forget that, right?
And everybody knows about it. We all know Matty Maroon. We all know that he has, he's trying to put windows in it. We know how he's getting around.
Exactly.
The,
so it's
the
like part
tickets.
of us,
Yeah.
right? Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's like the big example of, because it was a beautiful building, still is a beautiful building. And then that idea of fencing something off and saying you can't go in here makes it even more intriguing, because it didn't used to be fenced off. There was a while that people were just getting in there and going in, and then they started fencing it more and more, and still can't keep people out. But
Especially Matt.
Now we have to wait to see our city's own heritage in movies,
Yeah.
because we can't access it without finding ways away.
yeah.
I learned a specific attitude from one of my professors in the way that you approach communities. So when you approach a community, you are the expert in architecture and design. But every single other member of that community is also an expert, from oldest to youngest. They're an expert in their own community. So the kid that's playing on the sidewalk or playing soccer in the park, they are experts at that. They will always be far better than you at doing that in that community. Same for any other age range. So to keep that attitude in mind, that there's always something to be gained from some member of the community, is a great place to start.
Thank you. Are there any final thoughts or things you'd like to share?
Can I ask you a question?
Oh,
This
sorry.
isn't one I had written down. This came up from our discussion. You've mentioned vacant buildings, and particularly our city has a really great ability to find vacant land and care about it. I think Tiger Stadium, the little remnants of it, still showing up if the building was there. But what prompts that it has to be, per se, an open or a vacant building versus a field? And I think of field in the same way I think of discipline and education, in the same word I'm studying this discipline. There's something about a field and the ability to play on a field that allows situations and the nature of play to come into education. That they're never the same, they're constantly changing, and that we can gain life lessons from them. So the fact that kids are playing on a street, they have some ability to see potential and meaning in there. What makes you, and this doesn't have to be answered now, I'm just asking you, what directs you to specifically a vacant building? And I know you're architect and architectural and spatial, but a field and a blank space is also just as architecturally viable as a pre-existing building. So,
Well, honest answer, it's harder to project things onto a field and have more people see. Unless you're in an airplane or.
Yep.
Your answer.
Okay. Maybe I was a bit late to all this information because Olivia told me about this about an hour ago, and I decided it sounded like fun. But can you give us a little bit of context about yourself, about the studio that you're in?
Where you grew up to.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
Okay, well, it all started when I was 3 years old, and get it.
We only got 5 minutes.
Oh, me too. I have
It's
a
almost
class
over.
that starts in 10 minutes. I'm gonna be late, but.
Oh,
Is it your class?
Blame it on us.
Oh,
Yeah, it
Usually
actually
late
is
too.
her.
Usually
So-
show up with her.
Oh, well, as long as you get there before your professor.
Well, I like my personal goals, like, you know, leaving constituency behind, you know, like what I'm going in with. Like I'm all about technology, innovation, and how like these new ideas that just one person can come up with and influence and change whole communities and even as far as the world. Like I used an example in my blog about the invention of the blue LED, which allowed for white LEDs to be produced everywhere, the most efficient, readily available lighting on the market, which saves lots of energy and money. And like how things like that can change history. And that's kind of what I'm going in with, that innovation. And all right, I'm already resorting to buzzwords, so you get the idea.
To have an impact on something, you know, to feel a part that you've done something, to leave, Smith Group says, like, to leave a legacy, you know, have an impact on society, and to have a real large one, like creating a blue LED.
And I think definitely architects are more sensitive to stuff within our surroundings that have been. Nobody, I don't believe, outside of most of our construction profession, cares about the moment connection in a steel frame. You know what, that's given us a lot of opportunity, and, you know, we take for granted. I think one that I always ask people about is soap. What happened before we had soap, because that was a technology a long time ago, and how our society has been changed on a daily basis in the hygiene quality. And if you look at a lot of third world, you know, developing countries, hygiene would save a lot of larger catastrophes, and something as simple as soap. And nobody wanted soap to be, they didn't go around marketing it as the next great thing. Somebody just was like, wow, this is fantastic, it smells good.
More specifically, maybe what year are you in your program?
Year?
This is
Sophomore.
for school?
Yes.
Yeah?
Well, it's actually a little time. I'm in a transfership program. I spent 4 years at Oakland Community College to get my associates in architecture, and this is my 3rd semester. It's like, I don't know, that's 1.5 year.
Are you in a vertical studio then?
In what studio?
Vertical studio? Does LTU use
Like
the
a
same vocabulary?
third year?
Third year?
Are you going-
Sorry, I thought that was pretty
Senior.
consistent.
I guess
Schools, no?
senior.
No?
You date that.
Yeah,
That's the
I
UAD
guess
thing.
I guess
You
they could
will
call me
find that out
senior.
quickly. The
Oh,
word
okay.
aperture is
What?
not one that we use either. So neither is poche. I look like a fool. Poche. I know all you LTU folk do. UD does not. Poche doesn't exist.
It doesn't?
Hmm?
It doesn't?
Not my bowl.
Oh, well. Okay.
What is it, IDS 3 or something?
5.
So it's allied.
Yeah,
Allied
it's allied.
student. Okay.